Light fell from the chandeliers like molten gold, pooling across the polished marble. And if you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments, catching in the facets of crystal glasses raised in idle laughter. Silk skirts whispered in slow circles as couples turned through the waltz, and the air itself seemed perfumed with roses, wax, and expectation. Every eye in the ballroom searched for diversion, for scandal, for romance disguised as propriety. At the edge of the room, near the tall windows veiled in gauze, Miss Eleanor Whitcomb stood with hands loosely clasped, her posture a study in quiet dignity that invited admiration without requesting it from passing strangers. She had learned long ago how to occupy space without disturbing it, how to be present without ever appearing to impose. Orphaned young and welcomed into the Duke's household as a companion to his aunt, she had become as familiar to the estate as the portraits lining its corridors. Servants nodded to her with affection that bordered on loyalty, and visiting ladies observed her with speculative smiles that suggested future titles. Tonight, those smiles followed her like ribbons, tying her silently to expectations she had never voiced aloud nor encouraged by gesture, glance, rumor, or hopeful imagination around her presence. The Duke entered late, as was his habit, bringing with him a subtle alteration in the room's rhythm that required no announcement. Conversations softened, shoulders straightened, and admiration rearranged itself into careful composure. He moved with effortless confidence, greeting acquaintances with warmth that never lingered long enough to invite intimacy. When his gaze found Eleanor, it paused briefly, politely, as one acknowledges a familiar painting on a wall long admired but rarely examined closely. She inclined her head with gentle respect while something unspoken fluttered quietly beneath her composed breathing and measured stillness before turning away again to observe others. They spoke later beside a column half hidden by ferns, their conversation shielded by greenery but not by distance from curious ears. Eleanor listened as he described travel plans, estate matters, and trivial observations with the same calm civility he offered everyone. She answered with thoughtful brevity, sensing an unfamiliar restlessness beneath his polished tone. Laughter from nearby guests drifted between their pauses like intrusive punctuation neither of them acknowledged openly. A lady pretending to admire the ferns leaned slightly closer while a gentleman adjusted his gloves with conspicuous patience beside them, both listening without appearing to listen at all. It happened without drama, spoken in the same mild cadence he might have used to discuss the weather or a book left unfinished. He regarded her with absent kindness and said, "You have always been convenient." The words settled between them with deceptive softness before their meaning struck like cold water. Eleanor felt the sentence travel through her with astonishing clarity, touching memory, hope, and pride in equal measure. She did not breathe for several heartbeats while distant music continued politely behind her ringing ears and the watching strangers pretended sudden fascination with leaves and marble floor patterns nearby silently. She did not flush, protest, or allow her expression to fracture into anything so revealing as hurt. Instead, she inclined her head with grave courtesy, as though he had offered a minor observation requiring no reply. That composure, more than tears, unsettled those who had overheard. A murmur passed through the greenery and slipped eagerly into the ballroom beyond. Guests exchanged glances bright with speculation while fans paused midair and conversations faltered into curious fragments that chased her silence with embarrassing enthusiasm across the shining floor toward waiting listeners nearby tonight already hungry for scandal and whispered interpretation everywhere present. Eleanor excused herself with impeccable calm and moved toward the grand doors without haste. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as though she were crossing a fragile surface that might crack beneath sudden emotion. The music swelled behind her, indifferent and bright. No one attempted to stop her, yet many watched with undisguised fascination. Her reflection flickered in gilt mirrors between candle flames and curious eyes following the quiet procession of her departure like a solemn announcement nobody dared voice aloud within that perfumed glittering chamber of judgment and shifting loyalties tonight only beginning to sharpen noticeably around her retreat outward. Cool night air met her flushed skin as she stepped beneath the portico where rain stitched silver lines through the darkness. A footman hurried forward with concern, but she declined assistance with a faint shake of her head. The sound of the storm felt mercifully louder than the echo of that single word. Carriages rattled distantly along the gravel drive while lantern light trembled across puddles gathering near her slippers and damp hem catching faint splashes of cold water she scarcely noticed any more tonight, standing very still beneath shadow and rain and dawning understanding alone outside society's shelter entirely now. Inside, the Duke remained where she had left him, momentarily unaware that something irreversible had occurred. Conversation resumed around him with exaggerated brightness, as though laughter might erase discomfort. Yet he found himself listening for the subtle cadence of her voice and hearing only absence where it should have been. He glanced toward the doors once, twice, thrice, expecting her quiet return to restore familiar balance to the evening, but saw only strangers drifting past candlelight and speculative whispers already circling her departure like curious birds over newly turned earth nearby tonight, without explanation forthcoming for anyone present there still. When at last he learned she had departed into the rain without farewell, a peculiar chill threaded through his composure. He told himself it was concern for her comfort, nothing more. Yet the ballroom, still radiant with music and light, seemed inexplicably altered, as though a vital warmth had been quietly extinguished. For the first time that evening, the Duke felt the unsettling weight of silence pressing where her presence had always so conveniently been. He did not yet understand why that absence unsettled him more than gossip, ridicule, or social embarrassment possibly could within his guarded, carefully ordered heart. Morning arrived at the estate with deceptive gentleness, sunlight spreading across manicured lawns as though nothing of consequence had occurred the previous night. Dew clung to rose petals, birds rehearsed cheerful notes, and servants resumed their routines with disciplined efficiency. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, an absence pulsed like a quiet alarm no one wished to acknowledge aloud. Eleanor's place at the breakfast table remained undisturbed, her chair slightly withdrawn as she had left it, napkin folded with habitual precision beside untouched porcelain and silver awaiting a hand that would not return. The Duke noticed the chair before he noticed his own appetite had vanished. He poured tea he did not drink and unfolded the newspaper without reading a single line. Conversation from the staff faltered whenever he entered a room, their eyes lowering with respectful sympathy that irritated him more than open curiosity would have done. He told himself her departure was temporary, an impulsive reaction to embarrassment that time would correct. Yet the house felt oddly misaligned, as though familiar objects had shifted during the night into subtly incorrect positions he could not ignore. By noon, he requested information with measured calm that failed to conceal urgency from those who knew him well. A maid confessed Eleanor had packed quietly before dawn, declining assistance and leaving instructions that her belongings be forwarded nowhere. She had thanked each servant with personal warmth, offering no explanation beyond polite gratitude. The butler, usually unshakable, admitted she had pressed a small parcel into his hands for the Duke with a composure that suggested finality rather than temporary inconvenience. That word lingered in his thoughts like an echo he could neither silence nor fully confront. He opened the parcel alone in his study where firelight struggled against the brightness of day. Inside lay a slender book of pressed wildflowers collected during summer walks they had once taken across the estate meadows. Each brittle petal rested between pages annotated in her delicate handwriting, recording dates and weather with quiet affection. A single dried blue cornflower slipped free and landed upon his desk like a fallen memory. He remembered giving it to her absent-mindedly years before, unaware she had preserved it with such reverence and meaning. Outside the estate, society moved swiftly to interpret what it had only partially witnessed. Invitations arrived for the Duke that afternoon from ambitious families eager to fill what they assumed was an unexpected vacancy in his affections. Polite letters expressed concern for Eleanor's health while hinting boldly at eligible daughters ready to offer consolation. He found himself resenting their enthusiasm with surprising intensity, setting the envelopes aside unopened. Gossip traveled faster than carriages, and by evening, exaggerated versions of the ballroom exchange had reached neighboring counties with inventive cruelty and speculative embellishment added freely. Eleanor, meanwhile, traveled north in a modest hired carriage, watching the familiar countryside recede into uncertain distance. She kept her gaze steady upon the horizon, refusing herself the indulgence of tears that would blur both vision and resolve. In her reticule rested a letter of employment arranged weeks earlier through discreet correspondence, a governess position in a quiet household where her name carried no expectations. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against stone roads seemed to mark the steady dismantling of a life she had once believed permanently arranged around another's presence. By the second day she arrived at a modest country manor where ivy climbed stone walls and children's laughter echoed from open windows. The lady of the house welcomed her warmly, unaware of the quiet scandal trailing behind her composed arrival. Eleanor stepped into her new role with grateful precision, guiding lessons, correcting handwriting, and earning trust through patient intelligence. The simplicity of the household offered relief from scrutiny, yet every evening she felt the ache of memory pressed gently against her thoughts like a bruise not yet faded. Back at the estate, the Duke walked corridors that felt inexplicably longer without her measured footsteps beside his own. He noticed how often he turned to speak to her before remembering she was gone. Meals tasted bland, conversations hollow, and even the garden seemed to lack the attentive gaze that once appreciated each bloom. He carried the flower book with him from room to room without realizing he had done so, as though it were an anchor preventing his thoughts from drifting into unfamiliar emotional territory he had never explored willingly before. A week later, a visitor mentioned casually over tea that Miss Whitcomb had refused an offer of marriage from a prosperous gentleman in the countryside. The remark was delivered with amused surprise, suggesting foolish pride or lingering attachment. The Duke felt something sharp tighten in his chest at the idea of her refusing security while alone in unfamiliar surroundings. He dismissed the conversation abruptly, retreating to his study where the quiet pressed against him with growing insistence that demanded action rather than reflection. That evening, without announcing his intention to anyone, he ordered his carriage prepared for immediate departure. Servants exchanged confused glances as luggage was packed with uncharacteristic haste. He offered no destination, only curt instructions and unusual impatience that unsettled even the most composed among them. As horses were harnessed beneath gathering clouds, he stood at the window holding the fragile book of flowers, aware for the first time that convenience had never required such persistent memory, nor inspired such restless urgency within his carefully guarded heart. Rain threaded silver across the carriage windows as the Duke traveled north, watching the landscape blur into muted greens and grays that matched his unsettled thoughts. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against stone accompanied a realization he resisted naming aloud. He had rehearsed explanations, apologies, rational defenses, yet none felt equal to the quiet gravity awaiting him. Each mile seemed to peel away layers of certainty he had long mistaken for strength, revealing an unfamiliar vulnerability beneath polished restraint and inherited composure and dignity he once believed unshakable within himself during ordinary days before loss unsettled everything quietly inside today. He arrived near dusk at the modest manor where Eleanor had taken employment, ivy dark against stone walls and lamplight glowing through curtained windows. Children's laughter drifted outward, gentle and unguarded, striking him with unexpected tenderness. He paused before knocking, suddenly aware that he was an intruder upon a life already rearranged without him. The door opened to a housemaid whose polite curiosity sharpened when he requested Miss Whitcomb by name, his title insufficient to disguise the urgency in his voice. She studied him briefly, then gestured inward with cautious respect and visible speculation about their connection tonight quietly there. Eleanor descended the staircase with measured composure, one hand resting lightly upon the banister as though the gesture anchored her balance. She wore a simple gray dress, unadorned and practical, yet carried herself with the same quiet grace he remembered from candlelit halls. For a moment they regarded one another in silence that felt heavier than accusation. Her expression revealed neither surprise nor pleasure, only polite acknowledgement that he had crossed a boundary she had deliberately drawn between them since leaving the estate without farewell or explanation to anyone there, watching quietly, then now again tonight in lamplight together silently. They sat in a small drawing room where a coal fire glowed softly, filling pauses with gentle sound. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, posture attentive yet carefully distant. The Duke spoke first, offering apologies shaped by habit rather than true articulation. He explained concern, misunderstanding, and the unintended cruelty of careless phrasing. She listened without interruption, her gaze steady enough to compel honesty he had never practiced with anyone before, including himself. During years of guarded conversation and polite distance, he mistook for strength and control always maintained carefully around others nearby in life until now here tonight. She answered quietly, choosing words with deliberate care that gave them unusual weight. "Your Grace," she said, voice level, "I required only respect, never affection purchased through tolerance." The statement lingered between them with undeniable clarity. He attempted to interrupt, but she raised a slight hand that halted him more effectively than raised volume could have done. "I would rather be unwanted," she continued, "than be convenient to any man living." Her eyes remained calm, though something wounded flickered briefly before composure returned like a curtain falling gently into place again between them tonight in firelight silence surrounding both quietly. Understanding dawned slowly upon him, not as sudden revelation but as painful recognition of truths long ignored. He saw how often he had relied upon her presence without offering equivalent regard. Memories rearranged themselves into uncomfortable patterns, exposing selfish assumptions disguised as courtesy. The fire crackled between them while he struggled to reconcile pride with emerging humility. He did not know how to express in words suitable for such a moment without diminishing sincerity or appearing falsely dramatic before her steady watchful gaze across the narrow room tonight filled with tension and memory quietly pressing inward around them both now. A knock interrupted the charged quiet, and a gentleman entered with protective concern evident in his posture. He greeted Eleanor warmly before regarding the Duke with measured suspicion. Introductions were formal, restrained, and edged with territorial caution. The newcomer's presence suggested community regard for her welfare that the Duke had not anticipated. Eleanor assured the gentleman politely that the visit was brief and entirely proper. Though civil, the interruption emphasized how her world no longer revolved around ducal approval or expectation as it once had within estate walls years earlier before departure reshaped everything quietly for her life now elsewhere. When they were alone again, the Duke remained seated rather than retreating with offended dignity. That small decision felt strangely momentous. He admitted, haltingly, that fear of dependence had shaped his careless words. Need, he confessed, was unfamiliar and therefore unwelcome in his ordered existence. Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully, weighing sincerity against habit with careful discernment born from long observation of his character during countless conversations, walks, evenings shared quietly without either naming what existed between them beneath manners, expectations, and polite distance always maintained until now, here tonight, facing truth together honestly at last, perhaps uncertain still though hopeful. Outside, wind moved through garden branches, scattering late rose petals across dark soil like discarded thoughts. The sound reached them faintly through glass, underscoring the fragile stillness inside. He realized that leaving now would confirm every belief she held about his inability to remain when matters grew difficult. So he stayed, allowing discomfort to press against pride until something softer began to surface within his guarded chest where unfamiliar emotions stirred quietly, demanding acknowledgement he could no longer postpone before her steady, patient presence, watching him carefully across dim, firelit space tonight again together in silence shared reluctantly but honestly. Eleanor finally spoke with gentler tone, observing that apologies could not alter what had been revealed, only what might follow. She asked whether he had come to reclaim comfort or to understand consequence. The question settled heavily between them. He opened his mouth to answer, aware that whatever he said next would decide whether her silence remained a farewell or became the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. As firelight flickered softly across their faces and distant wind whispered through roses outside the window, carrying night deeper into uncertain hours ahead, waiting quietly for his truthful response now. Twilight settled over the countryside drawing room with a slow inevitability, as though the world itself hesitated to witness what was about to be spoken. Candlelight flickered along the edges of polished wood and softened the lines of Eleanor's composed face, yet nothing in her expression suggested ease. She sat with perfect stillness, hands folded in her lap, posture unyielding in its restraint, as if any fracture of emotion might undo the fragile authority she had rebuilt in silence since leaving the Duke's estate. He remained standing for a long moment, unaccustomed to rooms where his presence no longer dictated the atmosphere. The Duke had entered countless halls where conversation bent instinctively toward him, yet here he felt curiously unanchored. His gaze lingered on her as though searching for a version of her that still responded to familiarity, still softened at recognition, still belonged in the orbit he once assumed was permanent. But she did not yield even a fragment of that past. She was present but no longer accessible. At last he spoke her name, quietly, without title. It landed differently than it once had. She acknowledged it with a slight inclination of her head, neither warmth nor rejection, only acknowledgement. That neutrality struck him more deeply than anger would have. "I have come," he began, then faltered, the words insufficient against the weight of what he meant. He adjusted his gloves unnecessarily, a habit formed in rooms where composure replaced honesty. "Not to disturb your position here, nor to impose upon your employment. Only, to speak plainly if you will permit it." Eleanor's gaze lifted, steady and unreadable. "Plainness," she replied softly, "is rarely what men of your position are practiced in." The observation was not cruel, yet it carried truth sharpened by experience. He absorbed it without defense. "I did not understand," he said at last, the admission costing him more than any negotiation or treaty he had ever managed. "That is not an excuse, but it is the truth. I mistook your constancy for ease. Your presence for something guaranteed." A silence followed, not empty, but crowded with everything neither of them had yet dared to name. He continued, voice lower now, stripped of practiced authority. "When I said what I said that night, I did not consider what it would sound like to you. I considered only myself as I have too often done. Her fingers tightened slightly in her lap, the only visible sign that his words had reached her. Outside, wind pressed against the windows, carrying the faint rustle of leaves like distant judgment. I have spent the days since your departure, he said, discovering that silence can be louder than any accusation. Your absence has made it impossible to ignore what I dismissed while you were near. Her expression shifted then, subtly, not into softness but into something more guarded. And what exactly did you dismiss, Your Grace? He hesitated. Pride rose instinctively, then fell under the weight of necessity. That I depended upon you, he answered. Not in convenience but in ways I refused to name. Your steadiness, your judgment, your presence in my household, in my thoughts. I did not value it because I assumed it would remain regardless of how I spoke or behaved. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as though measuring whether honesty alone was sufficient currency for what had been lost. That is not affection, she said at last. No, he replied immediately. It is not enough. And I am beginning to understand that nothing I offer you now can pretend to repair what I diminished. The honesty in his voice was unpolished, unfamiliar. It lacked the assurance that had once made him untouchable in society's eyes. Here, stripped of audience and approval, he appeared not diminished in rank but in certainty. A knock sounded again at the door. This time it was firmer, deliberate. The interruption broke the fragile continuity between them. Eleanor rose first, composed as ever, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to contain emotion rather than display it. The Duke remained still, watching her as she crossed the room. There was something final in the ease of her movement, as though she belonged more to this modest space than to any grand estate he could offer. The door opened. A man stood there, plainly dressed, yet carrying himself with familiarity that needed no introduction. His eyes moved briefly over the Duke before settling on Eleanor with immediate concern. I was told there was a visitor, he said, voice calm but edged with protective awareness. I came as soon as I could. The implication was unspoken but unmistakable. The Duke registered it with a sharpness that surprised even him. Eleanor turned slightly toward the newcomer. There is no cause for concern, she said gently. His Grace was about to depart. Something tightened in the Duke's chest at the ease with which she redirected him from her space, as though his presence had already been categorized, concluded, and placed neatly aside. The man did not move immediately. If you require assistance, he said quietly, still watching the Duke, you need only ask. Eleanor offered a faint nod. I am quite well. Only then did the man withdraw, though not without a final glance that lingered a fraction too long. The door closed. Silence returned, heavier now. The Duke did not speak immediately. Something within him had shifted, not with anger but with recognition. He had come believing himself the center of consequence, only to discover he was now one possibility among others in her life. I see, he said at last, though it was not entirely clear what he saw. Eleanor returned to her seat, though she did not fully sit, remaining poised as though prepared for departure at any moment. You did not come here to observe my circumstances, she said quietly. So I will ask again. Do you seek comfort in being forgiven, or understanding in being refused? The question struck with precision. For a long moment he said nothing. In that silence, something irreversible gathered. Not anger. Not reconciliation. Something more fragile and more dangerous. Awareness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of certainty entirely. I do not know which I deserve, he said. Only that I cannot leave as I came. Eleanor studied him then, truly studied him, as though weighing not his title, nor his history, but the man standing stripped of practiced dominance before her. The candle beside them guttered slightly, throwing shadows that shifted across the room like unsettled thoughts. At last she spoke. Then you will remain in uncertainty, she said softly, until you learn the difference between needing someone and understanding them. The words were not acceptance, nor rejection. They were a boundary, a challenge. A verdict not yet finalized. Outside, the wind rose sharply, pressing against the manor as though the night itself had begun to lean closer, listening. The Duke did not move to leave, and Eleanor did not ask him to stay. But in the suspended breath between them, something neither forgiveness nor escape had yet claimed began to take shape, fragile as glass and twice as dangerous, while the candle between them flickered once and threatened to go out.